Hey everyone, back again for another deep dive, and this time we're tackling a research paper one of you sent in. Really interesting stuff.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's called Evaluating and Aligning CodeLLMs on Human Preference.
Catchy.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But it's all about how we judge these AI models that write code, those CodeLLMs.
Right.
And the big question is, do our evaluations actually line up with what human programmers actually want from these models?
Because at the end of the day, who cares if a CodeLLM writes flawless code if nobody actually wants to use it?
Exactly. And, the paper's abstract, it mentions how these CodeLLMs, they're already pretty good at generating code that's correct, but that doesn't automatically mean it's what humans would prefer.
Yeah, that's a really key distinction, isn't it?
Can you unpack that a bit more for us?
Sure. So think about it like this. Let's say you ask a CodeLLM to whip up a script to resize images.
Okay, pretty standard task.
Right. So it might give you code that technically works, but it could be using a really roundabout way to do it.
Oh, I see.
Or it might rely on some obscure library that most developers wouldn't touch.
So it gets the job done, but not in a way that's practical.
Yeah. Whereas a human programmer would likely write something much more straightforward, using common libraries that are well documented.
So both pieces of code work, but the human written one is just way easier for others to understand and maintain, right?
Exactly. It's all about that human touch, those preferences and best practices that aren't always captured in just making code that's technically correct.
It's kind of like when a GPS gives you the fastest route, but it sends you through all these back alleys and construction zones. And a human would probably just choose a slightly longer route that's, a more enjoyable drive overall.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And that's why this paper's focus on human preference is so important. They're really trying to move beyond just whether the code runs, but how well it matches what human programmers actually value.
So how do they actually measure this human preference? They mentioned this CodeArena benchmark. What's that all about?
So one of the things that makes CodeArena different is that it uses real-world user queries to set up these coding challenges.
Interesting. So like actual requests from people who need code for something specific.
Exactly. Like one task asks for code to, let's say, create a heat map from a CSV file using a specific Python library.
Okay, I can see how that's more realistic.
Yeah. It's the kind of thing a programmer might actually need to do at work. It's way more relevant than just some abstract self-contained coding challenge.
So not just hypothetical stuff. They're using real problems that people are actually trying to solve with code.
Exactly. And they've got a huge variety of these queries covering web development, data analysis, even automating tasks in like Google Sheets, even PowerShell stuff for system administrators.
Wow, so they're really trying to cover the whole spectrum of how people use code in the real world.
Absolutely.
That's really impressive, but how do they actually score the CodeLLMs if they're not just looking at whether the code works?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
So, okay, hit me with it.
They actually use another powerful language model, GPT-4o, to judge the code produced by the different CodeLLMs.
Wait, hold on. They're using AI to judge AI.
I know, right?
Isn't that a bit like the fox guarding the henhouse?
It might seem that way at first, but the key here is that GPT-4o has been specifically fine-tuned to evaluate code based on, you guessed it, human preferences.
So it's been trained to think like a human programmer.
Exactly. It looks at things like how readable is the code, is it concise, does it use appropriate libraries, and follow coding conventions. It's essentially acting as a stand-in for a whole panel of expert human programmers.
So it's like the ultimate code review.
Haha, in a way, yeah.
But can you give me like a real-world example of how this human preference judgment actually works?
Sure. The paper has some great examples in Figure 7. One task was to write Python code to grab the domain name from a URL.
Okay, got it.
The less sophisticated models produce code that, it worked, but it was really clunky and inefficient.
Like a long, winding road instead of the highway?
Right. But one of the more advanced models, it used a built-in Python library.
Yeah.
And did the whole thing with just one line of code.
Oh, that's elegant.
And GPT-4o, our human judge, it recognized that this concise solution was way closer to how a human programmer would approach it.
So even though all the code technically worked, GPT-4o could tell which one was like more in line with what a human would consider good code.
Exactly. And those subtle judgments, that's what CodeArena is all about. Going beyond just functionality and looking at whether the code is something a human developer would actually want to use.
I'm really starting to see how CodeArena is changing the game.
Yeah. It's definitely pushing the boundaries of how we evaluate these CodeLLMs.
Now, you also mentioned this other thing, SynCode-Instruct, this massive synthetic instruction data set.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that so important?
Well, remember how we talked about how much data these CodeLLMs need to learn? To really get them to understand human preferences, we need a truly massive amount of data, way more than we could ever get by hand.
Yeah, I can imagine. Getting a bunch of programmers to sit down and write out examples of good code, that would take forever.
Exactly, and that's where SynCode-Instruct comes in. They managed to generate almost 20 billion tokens of code and instructions, a data set that would be impossible to create manually.
20 billion, that's mind-blowing. How did they create a data set that huge without humans doing it all?
Well, they used this really clever two-stage process.
Okay, break it down for me.
So first, they used another powerful CodeLLM, Qwen 2.5 coder, to generate a massive initial data set of code and instructions. Then they took a smaller but super high-quality data set from GPT-4o, remember, our human judge.
Right.
And they used that to refine the initial output.
So it's like having a first draft written by a talented but unrefined writer and then bringing in a master editor to polish it all up.
Exactly. And you can see how well this approach worked in Figure 9 of the paper. Increasing the size of the data definitely helped performance, but the biggest jump came when they included that high-quality data from GPT-4o.
So basically, to get these CodeLLMs to really get what humans want, you need that combination of massive scale and high-quality data that reflects those human preferences.
You got it.
And that brings us back to something you touched on earlier, this idea that open source models could catch up to the proprietary ones.
Right, because one of the big obstacles for open source has been access to that kind of massive high-quality training data. But SynCode-Instruct shows that we can create these data sets synthetically, and that could be a game changer.
So CodeArena is pushing us to evaluate these CodeLLMs in a way that's more aligned with what we as humans actually want, and then SynCode-Instruct is giving us the tools to train those models to actually understand those preferences.
It's really exciting to see this all coming together.
It does feel like things are starting to click, you know?
They really do. And this raises some really interesting questions about what this means for the future of software development. What happens when AI can write code that's not just correct, but also elegant, efficient, and perfectly aligned with what we want?
Well, that's a conversation for part 2. We've covered so much ground here today, unpacking CodeArena, SynCode-Instruct, and this whole idea of human preference in code.
And there's so much more to discuss.
Exactly. So we'll pick up this thread in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Welcome back. We were just diving into CodeArena and SynCode-Instruct, those really cool advancements in how we're evaluating and training these CodeArens.
It really feels like we're entering this whole new era of software development, you know, where AI plays a much bigger role.
Absolutely.
But I gotta admit, all this talk about AI writing code, it makes you wonder about what it means for us human programmers.
Yeah, it's natural to think about that. Anytime a technology comes along that could automate something humans do, we start thinking about jobs and skills.
Right, exactly. So what happens to programmers if AI can write most of the code? Do we all just become like prompt engineers, just telling the AI what to do?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone has a definitive answer just yet. It's likely that the role of the programmer will evolve, just like a lot of jobs have evolved with automation.
Yeah.
You know?
So instead of being replaced, maybe programmers need to develop new skills, learn to work alongside the AI.
Exactly. Even if an AI can write code that's perfectly functional, it still needs a human to understand the bigger picture, you know,
right,
to define the goals, anticipate problems, and make sure the code aligns with the overall vision.
So it's like you can tell an AI to build you a house, but you still need an architect to design it and a construction manager to oversee the whole process.
That's a great analogy. We'll always need that human creativity, problem-solving, critical thinking, even if the actual writing of code becomes more automated.
So maybe instead of worrying about AI taking over coding jobs, we should be thinking about how it frees up human programmers to focus on those more strategic, high-level aspects of software development.
I think that's a much more productive way to look at it.
Yeah.
Imagine a world where programmers can delegate all those tedious, repetitive tasks to AI and spend more time on the parts of the job that really require uniquely human skills.
It's like having a super efficient assistant who handles all the grunt work so you can focus on the big picture.
Right. That sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. And think about the potential for innovation if AI can take care of the mundane coding stuff. It frees us up to explore new ideas, experiment more, really push the boundaries.
Exactly. It can be a catalyst for a whole new wave of creativity in software development.
Instead of being a threat, AI becomes this superpower for innovation.
It's all about reframing how we think about humans and AI. It's not about one replacing the other, but about finding ways for them to work together.
Yeah, leveraging each other's strengths.
Exactly. To achieve something greater than either could alone.
I love that. But it does make me wonder, if we're going to be relying more on AI to write code, how can we be sure that the code is high quality? That it's secure, free from bugs?
That's a really important question. And it gets to one of the biggest challenges in AI development, reliability.
Right.
We've been talking about how CodeLLMs are trained on these massive data sets, but those data sets aren't perfect. They can have errors, inconsistencies, even security vulnerabilities.
So the AI could pick up those bad habits and put them in the code it writes.
It's possible. It's like learning to cook from a cookbook with typos and some questionable recipes, You might end up with something edible, but not what you were hoping for.
Right. So how do we prevent that? How do we make sure the AI is learning from the best possible examples?
That's where good old-fashioned software engineering comes in.
Okay.
Researchers and developers are working on techniques to improve the quality and reliability of these data sets, Things like better error detection and correction, creating data sets that are more structured, follow best practices.
So it's not just about feeding the AI a ton of code and crossing our fingers.
Definitely not. There's a lot of careful work that goes into curating and checking the quality of that data.
And are there ways to build those best practices into the AI itself?
Absolutely. Researchers are developing new training methods that encourage the AI to prioritize things like code readability, security, and maintainability.
So they're trying to instill a sense of good code into the AI?
Exactly. Not just from a functional perspective, but from a human perspective, too.
Okay, that makes sense. But I still keep thinking about security. If AI is writing more of our code, how do we make sure it's not creating vulnerabilities that hackers could exploit?
That's a huge concern, and security researchers are definitely on top of it.
Okay, good.
One approach is to develop AI systems specifically for detecting and preventing security vulnerabilities in code.
So like an AI security guard that can spot weaknesses before they're exploited.
Exactly. These AI-powered security tools can analyze code, flag risks, even suggest fixes.
That's awesome. It's like having another set of eyes, but they can scan millions of lines of code in seconds.
And they're getting more sophisticated all the time, using machine learning to spot those subtle patterns and anomalies that could signal a vulnerability.
So it's like an arms race then. AI writing code, AI securing code.
In a way, yeah. As AI gets better at writing code, it also gets better at exploiting weaknesses. It's a constant back and forth.
That's kind of scary, but also really exciting.
It is both, for sure. But there are a lot of brilliant minds working on this, so I'm optimistic.
Me too. So we've talked about the need for new skills, the potential for more creativity, and the importance of security and reliability.
A lot to think about.
It is. But let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea of AI making code more accessible. You said if we could perfectly align CodeLLMs with human preferences, code could become a universal language accessible to anyone with an idea.
I did, yeah.
What did you mean by that? So before we went to not a break, really, more like a pause in the conversation. We were talking about how AI has the potential to make coding accessible to everyone, really anyone.
It's a wild thought, isn't it? Right now, coding's kind of like this exclusive club, It takes years of training to even get in the door.
Right.
But imagine if anyone, no matter their background, could turn their ideas into code.
That's a big if.
It is, but think about what we could accomplish if everyone had that power.
Okay, I'm game. Let's try and picture this. Say we've somehow managed to get that perfect alignment between AI and human preferences. No more needing to be a coding whiz to create software. You just need a good idea.
Exactly.
What does that world even look like?
I think we'd see this explosion of innovation across every field you can imagine.
Okay, paint me a picture. I want to see this world through your eyes.
All right, so let's say you're a doctor, and you've got this awesome idea for an app that analyzes patient data in a totally new way, right?
Okay, I'm following.
Something that could lead to earlier diagnoses, better treatment.
Sounds like a great idea.
But today, to make that happen, that doctor would either have to learn to code themselves or hire a whole team of developers.
Right, a huge undertaking.
But in this future we're talking about, they just describe their idea to an AI coding assistant, and boom, they have a working prototype, probably in a fraction of the time it would have taken before.
It's like giving every doctor a superpower. They can create custom tools to solve the exact problems they're facing.
Exactly. And it wouldn't just be limited to healthcare. Think about education.
Oh, yeah. Education could really be transformed.
Teachers could design these incredible interactive learning experiences tailored to each student.
Wow.
Small business owners could build their own e-commerce platforms without needing to hire expensive developers.
It's like we'd be unleashing all this pent-up creativity, all these entrepreneurs just waiting for the tools to bring their ideas to life.
Exactly. It'd be like the early days of the internet, but even more transformative, I think.
Okay, I'm sold on this vision.
Oh, yeah.
But, there's always a but.
Oh, I know that tone.
If anyone can use these AI coding tools, how do we stop them from being misused?
Right.
Couldn't someone use them to create harmful software, like malware or surveillance tools?
Absolutely. Those are real concerns. And it brings us back to this idea of responsible AI development.
Okay, so it's not enough to just create these powerful tools. We have to build in safeguards from the start.
Exactly. Think security protocols, ethical guidelines, really making sure this tech is used for good.
So we need to be having these conversations about the ethical implications of AI coding assistants right now, not waiting for problems to pop up.
Definitely. And it can't just be the developers who are thinking about this. We need a broader societal discussion about how to govern the use of AI, maximizing the benefits while minimizing the risks.
That sounds like a huge challenge.
It is, but I think humans are pretty good at adapting and finding solutions to tough problems.
I hope you're right. So let's say we figure it all out. We've got these AI coding assistants. They're reliable, secure, aligned with our values. What happens to the whole software development industry as we know it?
That's a tough one to predict. But I think it's safe to say it would change dramatically. The role of the software developer, it might become less about actually writing lines of code and more about things like architecting systems, defining requirements, guiding the AI.
It's like the shift from, say, manual labor to operating complex machinery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You still need skilled workers, but the nature of the work changes completely.
And that emphasizes how important education and training will be, right?
Absolutely. We need to prepare people for these new roles in this AI-powered software development world. It's not just about teaching people how to code, but about how to think critically, solve problems, collaborate with AI.
So we need a whole new approach to education.
For sure. It's an exciting challenge, though.
This has been an incredible deep dive, honestly. So much food for thought.
My pleasure.
It feels like AI coding assistants have the power to completely revolutionize software development, unlock so many possibilities.
I think they do.
We'll definitely be revisiting this topic in future episodes. I can guarantee that.
I'm sure we will.
But for now, this is the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and keep exploring, keep learning, and keep imagining the future you want to create.